strings that had not dried out, and she bound him with them. While men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Please, tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." The men lying in wait were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now, you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web and made them tight with the pin. Then she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great." Finally, after she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I've been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved and my strength would leave me, I would become weak and be like anyone else." When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he has told his whole secret to me." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." When he awoke from his sleep, he thought, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Samson. What do any of us remember about Samson? I can, these days, just about remember back to my teenage years. And I remember the Welsh singer Tom Jones, who had a top 10 hit with his song, Delilah. And with our mono vinyl record player turned up to maximum, these words echoed around our English suburban home. My, Delilah. Why, Delilah? Well, it's not exactly Shakespeare, is it? But it does sum up, I think, what many of us remember of Samson. A strong man with a weakness for beautiful women, and a weakness which reaches the point where he's lying there, his head resting in Delilah's lap, his head shaved, and the statement that he did not know that the Lord had left him. Don't you find that a profoundly sad statement? that a man whose life had started with such high expectations that he was going to be God's man for the hour should get to the point where he didn't know that the Lord had left him. And yet his story had started so well. If we go to Judges chapter 13, to the beginning of his story, Judges 13 verses 2 and 3, we read this, that there was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren, having borne no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, although you're barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now, how many other barren women can we think of who've received visits from the Lord, who has told them that they will conceive a child in their old age, and this child will achieve great things for God? Well, we've already looked at one or two of them already. So let's think of some of the children that those women had. They had children like Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Samuel, John the Baptist, and the list goes on and includes, yes, here, Samson. And of all the characters in the book of Judges, it's Samson who seems to fit the bill as the obvious candidate to be a deliverer of God's people. I mean, none of the other judges were. First up, we meet Deborah. I mean, a woman. A woman living in a male-dominated, patriarchal society, yet a woman who directs the troops of Israel. And then we meet Ehud. Ehud, the left-handed man, or as the Hebrew puts it literally, restricted in his right hand, which might possibly mean that he was a physically handicapped person, and yet, as we note, he goes on and single-handedly liberates the Israelites. And then we meet Gideon, a man so timid, the first time we meet him, he's cowering from the enemy, hiding in a wine press. And then there's Jephthah. He's a social outcast, the son of a prostitute, kicked out by the rest of his family. And so we could go on. Every one of them unlikely candidates for greatness. But not Samson. Not Samson. No social outcast was Samson. Just think of the parties he went to. And not timid either, tearing apart a lion as if he was swatting a fly. Not handicapped in any limb was Samson. And then we read at the end of chapter 13 the wonderful news concerning that promise. We read that the woman bore a son and named him Samson. The boy grew. The boy grew. Now there's British understatement for you. Grew. He grew beyond your wildest dreams. And he was no drug-induced Bulgarian weightlifter. He was the real McCoy. He was unique. Unique in physique, unique in promise, and unique in one other regard too. He didn't know that the Lord had left him. And how is that possible? How is it possible not to know that the Lord has left you? I mean, if he doesn't know that the Lord has left him, it suggests he didn't know when the Lord was with him. And how is that possible? Not to know whether the Lord is with you or has left you. I mean, if I were to say to you about some of your, a couple of your closest friends, call them Jim and Mary. I mean, I hope there aren't any Jims and Marys here tonight. If there are, this is nothing personal. But if I said to you about Jim and Mary, Jim and Mary broke up, you know. Yeah, I mean, she just dumped him. Of course, Jim doesn't know. It seemed rather incredible, wouldn't it? I mean, what kind of relationship is it that breaks up and Jim doesn't know? But Samson didn't know. He didn't know that the Lord had left him. When the angel came to his mother, he told her that Samson was going to be a Nazarite from the day of his birth. Now, Nazarite was somebody who took out a vow for a certain length of time, and there were certain rules they had to follow during the time they were a Nazarite. We find the rules governing Nazarites in the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 6. The first of them we find in verses 2 to 4. So 3 basic rules governing Nazarites, people who take out a vow to dedicate themselves to God for a period of time. What are they? Because this is what Samson is supposed to be and do. When either men or women make a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, to separate themselves to the Lord, they shall separate themselves from wine and strong drink. They shall drink no wine, vinegar, or other vinegar. They shall not drink any grape juice or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All their days as Nazarites, they shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. So you're going to be a Nazarite, take out a vow for a certain length of time. It isn't simply a matter of wine. It's not just a matter of the pleasures of alcohol. You have to give up everything possible, everything to do with grapes, their flesh, their skin, their juice, and their pips. You've got to live a completely grapeless existence. And the second and third requirements of a Nazarite, we read these in verses 5 to 6 of Numbers 6. All the days of their Nazarite vow, no razor shall come upon the head. They shall let the locks of the head grow long. All the days that they separate themselves to the Lord, they shall not go near a corpse. So, second requirement, never cut their hair while they're a Nazarite. Third requirement, never to go near anything unclean, in particular a corpse. Now, these are not difficult requirements, you might think. It's simply a matter of adopting a Rastafarian hairstyle, not eating grapes or visiting vineyards, not touching anything unclean, like an unclean animal and so on, and not attending funerals. So, how does Samson do? First of all, what about things on the grape front? Well, I think we can probably see how it happened. First of all, maybe just touching a grape, and then maybe, just nonchalantly, just flicking a pip that he found hanging around, then a dried raisin just slipped in the side of his mouth, then a big black juicy grape straight from the vine. And from there he graduated to his first glass. He became a connoisseur of all the great Philistine vintages, an expert on Chardonnay and Champagne. He became an expert on all of that. You can't keep him away from grapes. You remember the lion he killed? He killed it in a vineyard. I wonder what he was doing there. He meets his girlfriend Delilah in the valley of Sorek, that is, the valley of grapevines. Wonder why he was visiting there. And Samson, of course, is not supposed to go anywhere near a corpse, but Samson creates corpses. Thousands of them. He's supposed not to go near anything unclean, yet he creates those corpses using the fresh jawbone of an ass, an unclean object. He scrapes honey out of the carcass of a lion, an unclean animal. a Nazarite indeed. So, by the time we encounter Samson, relaxing under Delilah's massage, his head resting in her lap, there's only one vestige of his Nazarite vow left: his hair. And then, even that goes. And when it does, he didn't know that the Lord had left him. Poor old Samson was one of those people who seemed to think that appearances were sufficient. He was able to convey the illusion that he was a Nazarite, but only the bare minimum. His hair. He was supposed to be distinctive, but after a little while you could hardly pick him out of a Philistine crowd. And of course, as followers of our Lord Jesus Christ, we too are supposed to be distinctive. In a verse from John's Gospel, which should probably be familiar to us by now this week, Jesus said, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." That's our distinctive characteristic. Now, being a real Nazarite is fairly difficult, but Samson found ways to fake it. Difficult to fake, but he found ways to do it. And loving our fellow believers, especially when we disagree with them, is also difficult to fake, but like Samson, I think sometimes we find faking it easier than actually doing it. What do we learn from Samson? Well, after a little while of reading the story of Samson, especially if we've been reading the book of Judges, let's have a look at a couple of things that we might learn about Samson. I'm just going to have a look at some comparisons here between Samson and Israel. If that's possible, here we are. So let's compare Israel that we know and Samson. So first of all, with Israel, as we know, Israel was dedicated to God from the beginning with Abraham, and with Samson, he was dedicated to God from his birth. With Israel repeatedly breaks its covenant with God, and Samson repeatedly breaks his Nazarite vow, as we've just seen. Just as Israel goes after foreign gods, so Samson keeps going after foreign women. The wife he marries at the beginning of the story is a Philistine. The prostitute he goes to in Gaza is a Philistine. Delilah is a Philistine. Philistines, every single one of them. And then, just as Israel ends up in the temples of foreign gods, so Samson ends up in the temple of Dagon at the end of the story. And just as Israel never learns from its mistakes, Samson never seems to learn from his mistakes. Let's have a look now at another comparison between two of Samson's women. In Judges chapter 14, Samson marries his Philistine wife. And then in Judges 16, which is the chapter we read from, he's with another Philistine woman, not quite sure, let's call her, his girlfriend, let's say, in Judges chapter 16. Now, in Judges 14, once Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw a Philistine woman. And in Judges 16, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Timnah is in Philistia, she's a Philistine, and the valley of Sorek is in Philistia as well. Delilah's a Philistine woman. The Philistines say to his wife, coax your husband. This is where they want to know the answer to that riddle of his. Remember the riddle that he made? They want to find out the answer. Coax your husband so he gives us the answer to the riddle. In Judges 16, they say, coax him, the secret of his strength. Judges 14, his wife says, you do not really love me. In Judges 16, she says, how can you say, I love you? In Judges 14, because she nagged him, and in Judges 16, as we've already said, finally, after she had nagged him with her words, in chapter 14, on the seventh day, he told her, well, you already know what's going to happen in chapter 16, don't you? In chapter 16, he told her his whole secret. I mean, doesn't he ever learn? Chapter 16 is an action replay of chapter 14. So Israel is God's chosen. Israel is Samson. Samson is Israel. What Samson does is what Israel does. What Israel does is what Samson does. And the tragedy of Samson, the individual, simply underlines the tragedy of Israel as a whole. Samson didn't know. What about Israel? What about us? What if Samson turned up at your church next Sabbath? How do you think the conversation might go? Oh, hi, Samson. Great to see you. Haven't seen you for a while. What you been up to, mate? Met any more Philistine women? Carried any more gates to the top of the hill? Visited the red light district of the Gaza Strip on your day off? Could you recommend any good vineyards? And then you say, yeah, probably a good idea we didn't employ him as our youth pastor. Here's a man driven less by the Spirit and more by his hormones. And I think that's why. That's why he didn't know that the Lord had left him. You recall that when our Lord Jesus hung on the cross in agony, he shouted out, here in Mark 15, verse 34, it says, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? But from Samson, not a word, because he hadn't a clue. He didn't know that the Lord had left him because he'd never taken the time to know the Lord when he was with him. So when he left, he couldn't tell the difference. A local council near to where I live in England a little while ago looked at its records and discovered that one of its tenants living in one of its units had not paid his rent for 3.5 years. So they decided, well, better do something about this. They wrote to him, got no reply, sent a final reminder, got no reply. Right, this requires action. They went to his flat and they found him all right. They had to break down the front door to get in, but once they were in, he didn't put up any more resistance. Because when they went into his kitchen, all they discovered was his skeleton. He died. He died 3.5 years before. I mean, and yet his landlord, his council landlord, didn't know. The next door neighbors didn't know. I mean, your tenant and your next door neighbor lies dead in his kitchen for 3.5 years and nobody knows. Now the neighbours were most upset. They'd spoken to him quite often, they said. Well, you know, once or twice maybe. And, well, now you mention it, no, they hadn't seen him lately. Seemed like a really nice fellow, though. No, a really nice bloke, yeah, but no, we never really did get to know him. So when he died, they didn't know. And Samson didn't know. I mean, doesn't that make you want to weep? What a wasted life. I mean, so what if he'd thrashed around with the jawbone of an ass? So what if he'd transported the gates of Gaza to the top of the hill? So what if he'd devised fiendishly difficult riddles? So what if he'd caught 300 foxes? So what if he didn't know that the Lord had left him? So what? And yet, Samson lived an extremely busy life. His agenda was always full. It's exhausting reading what he did. But it amounts to very little, because he specialized in the spectacular rather than the important, the superficial rather than the profound, flirting with Philistines rather than getting to know the Lord. But it's not just Samson, is it, really? I think in many ways we have a desperate need today, the desperate need in the church today. And that need is not for a greater number of intelligent people, nor for a greater number of educated people, but rather for a greater number of spiritually deep people. People who know when the Lord is with them, and just as importantly, when he is not. People who have Jesus Christ as their Lord and Master, and avoid the tragedy of Samson, who didn't know whether the Lord was with him or had left him, because he thought that concocting riddles, catching foxes, or falling for the next Philistine beauty were just greater priorities. But there can hardly be any higher priority than knowing the Lord. To live deep, profound, spiritually fulfilled lives in his presence. As Paul puts it in Ephesians chapter 3, I pray that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Amen.